Good morning, everybody. I think we are ready to start. Just requesting some of our guests who are standing at the back, if you can be seated so we can move on with the program. Thank you. A very good morning to you all. I'm Nilesh Gounder from the School of Economics here at USP. On behalf of USP, Faculty of Business and Economics, School of Economics, Center for Economic Policy and Modeling, Pacific Sub-Regional Office of the Asian Development Bank. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all this morning to this short public seminar. I know the weather is not great outside. We've also had a big function in Nandi, and probably why we have slightly less than expected attendance this morning. But despite all that, once again, thanks for coming. Before I move on, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker for this morning, Professor Yasuyuki Sawada, with a traditional short welcome. Thank you very much, Kushbu. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Nigel Haley, the Vice Chancellor of Fiji National University, and my good friend Humphrey from private sector. It's good to see you, Humphrey. And I still remember how you won bag. So if you come back for the Pacific Update Conference next month, we can sort that out. So I guess you have the program with you. After this, I'm going to invite Dr. Roop Singh, my colleague from School of Economics, who will provide brief welcome remarks and also introduce Professor Sawada. After that, Professor Sawada will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some 10-15 minutes, depending on how much time we have for questions, answers, and discussion. So I'll now invite Dr. Roop Singh.
Professor Yasuyuki Sawada, Chief Economist and Director General of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperations Department of the ADB, and also the Adjunct Professor of the Modeling Center, USP, Professor Nigel Haley, the Vice Chancellor of the Fiji National University, staff and heads of the various institutions of the Fijian government, distinguished representatives of the various regional international organizations, staff, and students of the university. Welcome to the University of the South Pacific. I'm indeed grateful that you are able to be here this morning, despite the two-day intensive meeting in Nandi last week. This meeting this morning here is on the public lecture of the Asian Development Outlook, and I think the Pacific is an important element of that. And we are delighted that Professor Sawada could be here this morning to speak on that and give us a perspective on the Pacific, particularly on the climate change aspect. I'd also like to congratulate the USP Center for Economic Policy and Modeling, the acting director, as well as the school staff who have worked hard to bring this event to light. Let me briefly introduce Professor Sawada to you, and I'm pretty sure most of us would know him by now. Professor Sawada is a Japanese national. He holds a doctorate degree in economics from Stanford University in USA. He's got a few master's degrees as well from Japan. Prior to the ADB, he was a professor in the Faculty of Economics at University of Tokyo. Currently, he is affiliated to a few other international organizations where he is publishing a lot in the various areas of development economics. Currently, he's got about 60 or so peer-reviewed research articles, and we are very delighted to have Professor Sawada with us this morning. With these words, I warmly invite Professor Sawada to present his address. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ruk Singh, for a very warm, nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. I know this is Monday morning, raining, and also a little bit hungover from the weekend. But in spite of this, I really appreciate your participation present here today. So let me put my slides on. Yeah. Is there a clicker? No, no. Okay. Yeah. Give me a second. So let me spend 45 minutes talking about Asian Development Outlook 2019. As already being introduced, Asian Development Outlook, or in short, ADO, this is the flagship publication, flagship report of Asian Development Bank, ADB, and we publish ADO 4 times a year, and basically updating growth forecast and inflation forecast over the 2-year horizon. And then out of 4 times, we have quite detailed report with a thematic chapter. This time I'd like to share with you very first 2019 ADO with thematic chapter on disaster resilience. So this is outline. First, I'd like to share with you broader economic outlook of Asia, past year and this year, next year, 2 years horizon, followed by trade conflict between China and the US, how that affects Asian economy as well as Pacific economies. And the third part, I'd like to place a focus on Pacific economic outlook and briefly touch upon what's the performance and what's the likely growth and inflation this year, next year of Fiji. And toward the end, I'd like to share with you main key messages from our theme chapter, Strengthening Disaster Resilience. So this is the menu. So first, broader Asian outlook. There are basically 4, actually, can I use this microphone as well? Okay, yeah. So first part, there are basically a few key messages. Number 1, developing Asia will continue its growth rate, 5.7% overall this year and 5.6% overall next year. Okay, I can touch this. Okay. And so this is the number 1 key message. Close to 6% growth rate. This is slightly moderating if we compare from last year and the last few years, but still Asia will continue 6 or so, around 6% growth rate. This is quite high if we look around the globe, and more than 60% of global growth is still created by developing Asia. By the way, developing Asia is a 46 member country of ADB in Asia and Pacific region. So whenever I say Asia or Asian Pacific, that refers to 46 member countries. So this growth will continue, and but the largest economy in this developing Asia and Pacific region, China's growth rate is slightly moderating this year and next year. In contrast, second largest economy, India, growth will be uplifting over the 2-year horizon. So this is a broader picture. In spite of this continued robust growth of Asia, inflation rate is still under control. There is no sign of overheating. 2.5% overall Asian Pacific region this year, next year, which is well below last 10-year inflation rates, that is 3.2%. So having seen this robust growth continued and well-managed inflation, there are potential risks to the economy. Number 1 risk is prolonged trade tension between US and China. That seems to affect both the positive and negative impact on Asian economy. So I will closely share with you our studies on this issue. And finally, resilience, disasters triggered by natural hazards. Asian Pacific region, especially Pacific region, seems to be disproportionately affected by disasters. So in long-term horizon, this is medium-term, longer time horizon, disasters are really a big risks to the robust Asian Pacific economy. So it's really important or indispensable to make investment, prevention, and preparedness to tackle and heading off disaster risks. So these are the main key messages of Asia Outlook as well as the same chapter. So now let me a little bit in detail talk about the Asia growth outlook. As I said, the Asian growth, although it's continuing around 6% growth rate, but slightly moderating. Blue is 46 member countries, developing member country. If we exclude already high income of Asia, developing Asia, Korea, Taipei, China, Hong Kong, China, and Singapore, that number is shown in a red line in the left, more than 6% consolidated growth, but still trend, overall trend is a downward trend. The reason behind this global slowdown of growth due to electronics cycle and also production cycle in global economy. Consolidated growth of developed economy of 3 areas, US, Euro area, and Japan. Last year was 2.2% growth rate, likely to slow down to 1.9%, and this year and 1.6% next year. So reflecting this global slowdown, Asia growth is slightly slowing down trend. Okay. But it's not necessarily really mainly driven by US-China trade conflict. Rather, as I said, this is a part of a global production cycle, especially a semiconductor production cycle. And Asia is a part of this global value chain. So this chart shows the global cycle. So red line and blue line shows the global Purchasing Manager Index, PMI. This is the overall private sector subjective assessment of growth. So actually we see year 2017, we see upward lifting overall business up until first half of 2018. Then latter half of, since the middle of last year, global business cycle seems to be tilted downwards. And the green line shows a global trade expansion. So trade trend also follow the same. And this is mainly driven by global business cycle. Although last year, US and China started imposing trade measures. Okay. So this is the overall growth outlook of Asian Pacific region. And because of this global cycle, Asia's export on the left and Asia's overall import shown in the right shows the same pattern. So year 2017, it's expansion. And then since the latter half of last year, tilted downwards. Okay. So reflecting this, overall Asia Pacific region's growth is slowing down. Having said this, currently Asia's growth is not necessarily entirely driven by export or global economy. Rather, actually a domestic economy seems to play a very important role to sustain Asia's growth. So these are the major Asian Pacific regions developing countries. Left PRC, India, and also ASEAN 5 countries, and then NIES, already high income country in the middle, and then ASEAN 5 countries. Yellow dot shows the growth rate of year 2017 and 2018 compared. And we can do exercise, decompose overall GDP growth into different domestic demand, different demand component. We can see contribution of orange part is the largest in almost all the country. Orange part shows the domestic consumption. And gray part is second largest, which is the investment part, both public and private. So we can overall understand, currently Asian growth is driven rather domestic consumption, domestic investment, rather than export. So actually, this is the one important characteristics of Asia's growth. So let me closely look at the sub-regional pattern. Top left is East Asia. East Asian economy last year was 6.0% overall, slowing down 5.7 and 5.5 this year, next year. This slowdown is mainly driven by China, PRC, which is the largest economy in this sub-region. 6.6% growth rate last year will slow down 6.3% this year, and next year 6.1%. Other East Asian economies are well connected with China through supply chain networks. As a result, overall growth rate will slowing down. Having said this, already upper middle or high income economy East Asia continue to grow at 6% or 5.5%. That's really, in other angle, we can say this is very high, fast speed. Second is Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia also, because of this global trend, global business cycle tilted downwards, and Chinese growth slowing down, Southeast Asia growth will slightly moderating this year, 5.1% last year, down to 4.9% next year. However, next year, year 2020, overall Southeast Asia will likely to uplift, mainly due to recovery of global economy, as well as Chinese export to the U.S. slowing down, so other Asian economy, especially Southeast Asian economy, can potentially gain. So this overall net impact seems to be positive next year. Top right is South Asia. South Asia is the fastest growing sub-region in Asia. So last year, 6.7% consolidated growth will accelerate up to 6.8% next year, this year, and 6.9% next year, which is mainly driven by largest economy India, gets growth acceleration momentum. 7.0% last year growth will go up to 7.2% this year and 7.3% next year. Second largest economy in this region, or third largest economy in this sub-region, Bangladesh, even grow faster pace, 8.0% this year and next year. So overall, South Asia growth seems to be going very well. And as I will briefly touch upon later, India's growth and also Bangladesh growth is really driven by lively domestic consumption. Central Asia, 4.4% last year's growth rate, slightly going down to 4.2% this year, next year, mainly because largest economy in this sub-region, Kazakhstan's growth rate is slowing down. Kazakhstan is an oil producing and exporting country. Global oil price slightly declined end of last year, reflecting this, Kazakhstan economy slowing down. As a result, overall Central Asia slowing down. Pacific region, last year the growth rate was 0.9%, quite low. This is due to natural disasters and calamities hit this sub-region, especially largest economy in Pacific sub-region, PNG, was hit by earthquake last year, and natural gas production export really negatively affected. So because of PNG growth down to 0.2%, overall consolidated the Pacific growth was 0.9%. Of course, there are other disasters like Cyclone Gita hitting Tonga, etc. But this year, because recovery of PNG's gas production exports and also lively tourism, altogether consolidated growth rate will be 3.5% this year, and next year more than 3% continued. So this is the Pacific sub-region. So this is the overall picture of sub-region. So now let me talk about China and India a little bit. As I said, Chinese growth shown in a red line in left, slowing down gradually. Actually, this few last year and this year, next year's slowing down pattern is not new. If we trace back 2 decades, this is a continued growth rate slowing down. There are 2 elements which can explain this Chinese growth slowdown. Number one, China has been really growing fast. in last 2 decades and already reached upper middle income. So it's natural for any country successfully achieve a development to encounter slowing down. Japan, US, European country, Korea, Taipei, China, all went through the same pattern, which is called the convergence. So China really, because of successful development, it's natural for China, medium-term, long-term, encounter growth rate slowing down. Second reason is China is, in this process of development, China went through large-scale structural transformation from a manufacturing sector-driven economy to more wider service sector-driven economy so that people's livelihood can be going up. Actually, supply-side decomposition of GDP growth shows the clear pattern. Growth rate driven by manufacturing sector, this dark blue, proportion is continuously slowing down, and then orange part showing contribution of service sector expanding. So this is really a result of people getting richer and started demanding a wide variety of service products. So this is the natural consequences of growth, development, successful growth and development, as well as a structural transformation. Third factor is China. What's the number one risk to Chinese economy? US-China trade tension, that's number one. Also, another number one is domestic financial sector's instability. Accumulated local government debt and also non-performing loan of state-owned enterprises. These are the potential concern. So Chinese government really aware of this potential risk of financial stability, financial risk. So in last few years, government really committed herself or himself to heading off or eliminate this potential financial risk. So number one priority of Chinese government right now is control financial sector, controlling shadow banking, also controlling unproductive credit expansion. So we can see this commitment of government is materializing. Green line on right shows the size of shadow banking sharply declining, and also red line on the right chart showing overall measure of overall loan size, social financing size, also gradually declining, showing that Chinese government commitment to heading off financial risk is really materializing. So in other words, China's government is letting growth slightly slow down because of this priority of controlling of financial risk. On the other hand, second largest economy, India, growth rate, left chart, red line, 7.0% last year, accelerating up to 7.2 and 7.3% next year. Main driving force is engagement of government in reforming economy, high-valued currency demonetization policy adopted a couple of years ago, and also government adopted goods and service tax a couple of years ago. So these major reform seems to be materializing, setting better enabling a business environment. And again, decomposition of a growth rate in terms of demand, showing a blue part is the largest contributor. That's a domestic consumption, followed by a gray part, which is a public and private investment. So this government reform seems to be materializing, pushing up economic growth. And Purchasing Manager Index and manufacturing sector, again, this is a subjective assessment of business personnel and managers, is uplifting and upward trend. And this is really consistent with the macroeconomic indicator we are using. Then inflation rate, global food price fluctuated a little bit and global oil prices also increasing trend sharply decline end of last year. We see some fluctuation of major commodity prices globally. However, this year, next year, food price and oil price seems to be stabilized around a moderate level. So overall, we forecast 2.5% inflation this year and next year, which is well below last 10 years averages. So inflation expectations are well anchored in Asian Pacific region. So there is no sign of overheating or generating a negative impact. So having seen a rather robust growth continued in Asia and moderate inflation rates, what's the number one risk? As I said, prolonged China-US trade tension. Especially, I'd like to emphasize uncertainty over settlements. There is a positive scenario: U.S. and China will reach an agreement, and also even lower tariff rate. But another scenario is escalation. And almost daily, we see a positive sign and negative sign. And just this morning, we received President Trump announced imposing a 25% and enforcing a 25% tariff for current, tariff around 10%, lifted up to 25%. So daily we see some news. So this uncertainty over the destination of a trade dispute itself seems to generate negative impact on investment. Naturally, private sector, under this uncertainty over trade policy, will take a wait-and-see decision. So overall, investment will slowing down, production slowing down. So that will be contributing to negative growth rate. So actually, using a newspaper article, we did a search. This is for China. We did the search, keyword search. China, U.S., trade tension, trade risk, etc., etc. We set the keywords, and then we search. Based on the number of hits and frequency of these keywords, we constructed consolidated measure of trade uncertainty. So this is a time series measure we constructed through a newspaper article keyword search. We can see three spikes. Around 1995, when intellectual property rights are the issue between US and China, we have a big spike. And when China joined WTO, another spike. But the current spike or degree of uncertainty seems to be historically highest. And in fact, if we match investment data and also trade uncertainty measure, we can see these spikes on average decrease overall investment in China 1 percentage point. That will definitely slowing down production growth rate. So I think this is the most important or most serious source of risk to rather robust Asian economy. So, in order to deep dig a little bit, I'd like to briefly mention trade conflict between US and China. US started imposing a few trade measures early last year. Initially, it was regardless of the origin of the product, US started imposing tariff measures over solar panel, washer, steel, aluminum. But this became a bilateral issue between US and China mid last year. And currently, Chinese export to the US, in total 250 billion or so amount of part of Chinese export to US, exposed to U.S. Tariff measures, around 10%. And then this morning, President Trump said that out of 250 billion, 200 billion, current 10% tariff rate will be increased up to 25% this coming Friday. So that announcement was just made this morning. From U.S. to China, 110 billion part of exports exposed to Chinese tariff measures. So these bilateral tariff measures are the most significant concern right now. And in last few months, this current status quo seems to be stable. So first, we would like to quantify what's the likely impact if current situation status quo continue. Although President Trump showed some change of policy, but first, I'd like to quantify. We'd like to see what's the likely impact, quantify likely impact if this current status quo continue 2-3 years from now. Second scenario we wanted to see what's the likely impact is full-fledged bilateral trade tension. So all the goods and services traded between US and China, both sides 25 tariff measures. So that's the escalation scenario. So this is basically bilateral trade policy measures, but through the supply chain network or global value chain network, this trade measure will cause an impact, spillover effect on other non-China Asian economy. Smartphone, for example, smartphone produced in China, exported to US, now face tariff. So after tariff price of a smartphone, made in China smartphone, price will goes up in US market, naturally demand goes down. So that leads to export going down, made in China smartphone, and production going down. Smartphone parts and intermediate goods not only produced within China, but also other Asian economy. So made in China smartphone export decline and production decline will generate a negative spillover effect for other Asian economy. So this is a negative indirect effect of trade tension between US and China affecting other Asian economy. So we would like to quantify this. In order to quantify this, we need a data which captures all the supply chain network, input-output relationship. Luckily, ADB has international multi-regional input-output table, so we can use this good source of information from ADB's I/O table. Second, also another impact, likely impact is Chinese, made in China smartphone export to US slowing down. Other Asian countries can expand production and export. So this is the likely positive trade redirection effect. So basically, we'd like to quantify, we quantified supply chain network effect as well as a trade redirection effect. Okay. So because of time shortage, I'd like to give you just main punchlines. So left set of figures, we use an I/O table to quantify overall impact using I/O table and the current scenario. So if current scenario, 250 export China to the US 10%, and then US to China 110 billion export around 10% trade measures. If this status quo continue 2-3 years, what's the likely impact? Chinese economic growth rate will slow down 0.25 percentage point, spread over 2-3 years. So single year, probably growth rate will slow down 0.1 percentage point. Okay. This is negative, but likely small. Other Asian economies, actually green part shows the trade redirection effect. So China, made in China exports slowing down, so other Asian economy can produce more and export more to the US market. That will pushing up growth rate. That is shown in green. And the blue is a negative supply chain spillover effect. So Chinese exports slowing down, so other Asian economy suppliers negatively affected. But blue, supply chain network effect seems to be rather limited, but the trade redirection effect shown in green is positive. So overall net impact seems to be positive. Although magnitude is close to zero. For example, so actually we computed for Fiji for today's lecture. Fiji overall impact will be 0.04 percentage point growth rate increase spread over 2-3 years. So single year 0.01 percentage increase. Okay. This seems to be mainly trade redirection effect. Chinese garment industry and the textile industry products export to US slowing down. So I think it seems Fijian garment producer gain from this, capturing U.S. market. And other sectors altogether seems to gain, but the magnitude seems to be very small. So left is under current scenario. What happens if all the goods and services traded between U.S. and China expose the 25% tariff measures on U.S. side and China side? Actually, qualitative result the same. Magnitude seems to be expanded slightly. Chinese growth will slow down over 2-3 years, 1 percentage point decline. So single year, 1/3 percentage point growth rate decline. Fiji, 0.12 growth rate increase, single year, 0.04 percentage point growth increase. So again, these are positive for Fiji and other Asian economies, but the magnitude seems to be small. So direct and indirect impact seems to be rather limited. However, on top of this, as I explained before, uncertainty itself seems to generate pessimism and lose of confidence in investors and consumers that will fuel and the negative impact of trade measures. So I think that's also impact we should separately consider. So now let me talk about the Pacific regions. As I said, Pacific regions, last year's growth rate was rather slow because of the number of natural calamities hitting this region: earthquake in PNG, Cyclone Gita, tropical depression, Jerawat in FSM, and Cyclone Hora, volcanic eruption in Vanuatu. So these calamities overall are pushing down Pacific economy. Consolidated growth of Pacific sub-region of 0.9% last year. However, this year and next year, we see a stronger reconstruction and rebound. So more than 3% growth will be achieved this year and next year. And to facilitate this process, continuous reform engagement, and also other measures to reduce disaster vulnerability and economic vulnerability. That's a key for Pacific region to continue growth recovery. So looking over a few years back, actually Pacific economy has been growing a lot, close to 9% a few years back, slowing down because of natural disaster and also other instabilities of the economy. Now, overall Pacific economy is in the process of recovery. So again, reform and building up resilience seems to be really key to continue this growth momentum. And larger economy, which is shown in yellow line, seems to be outperform smaller counterparts, including South Pacific, North Pacific, and small islands. But the overall trend is the same. So growth rate slowing down last few years. Now Pacific economies overall in the process of recovery. PNG, as I said, earthquake really pushed down growth rate last year. But this year we see strong recovery. And 3.7% this year and 3.1% next year. And also fiscal reform seems to be moving towards the right direction. And so we see some raising revenues pattern in PNG. Also improvements in private investment seems to be emerging due to more market-based foreign exchange market. So PNG hit by natural disaster, it's in a recovery process, and policy direction seems to be moving for the right direction. Now let me talk about Fiji. This is a little awkward in this audience. I'm presenting Fiji, but anyway, this is the consolidated view of ADB economists. Growth in Fiji was maintained 3% last year, and before 3%. And this year, growth rate will accelerate up to 3.2% and 3.5%. But one caveat is our forecast, we made this forecast April 3rd, officially announced April 3rd. So our data is based on early March situation. We are aware that Fiji Bureau of Statistics released GDP data changing a base year from 2011 to 2014. So our forecasts are all based on 2011. And so because of that, our numbers seems to be lower than, especially past growth rate is lower than Fiji Bureau of Statistics revised up growth rate. Officially, Fiji's GDP growth rate rebased from 2011 to 2014. Now, 2017 growth rate should be 5.2% rather than 3%. 2016, because of the cyclone Winston, we set 0.7% growth rate. But Statistical Bureau's updated figure based on 2014 figure, growth rate should be 2.7% rather than 0.7%. So there is some updating. So we will update our growth numbers in next ADO. We will release late July, and we will make appropriate adjustment. But anyway, so this is based on 2011 growth forecast. So there are some discrepancy between national statistics and our growth statistics. And also forecast to be updated in a couple months. So not to mention, Fijian economy is driven by service sector. More than 67% of GDP growth is generated by service sector. And out of service sector, tourism is the core sector. And strong tourism seems to continue. So that's why we upward revised growth rate. Current 3.0% last year to 3.2 and 3.5%. Okay. And strong tourism seems to continue. So it's very important for Fiji and the Fijian government to engage, make a tourism sector more sustainable, more environmental, strong environmental management, investment planning and promotion. Also now we have increasing flights connecting different Pacific Rim countries, including US, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore. So not to mention Australia has been the largest source of tourists, followed by New Zealand. In addition, I think there is a scope for Fiji to expand more tourists coming from different Pacific Rim countries. So I think all seems to be quite robust. So in order to make it continued, I think sustainability is a big issue. So now, so this is a nice segue, seeing Fiji's economy, making a growth more robust and also tackling a potential risk of disaster. So this is a nice segue to our thematic chapter. So I'd like to spend 7 minutes on theme chapter on disaster resilience. So Asia, so first I'd like to start saying that Asia is a region disproportionately affected by different type of disasters. Disaster triggered by natural hazards, largely speaking, there are 3 types. First one is weather-related disasters or hydrometeorological disasters. Cyclone, typhoon, floods, and droughts. Second set of disaster is geophysical or geological disasters. Earthquake, volcanic eruption, and tsunamis. Okay. Third one is biological disasters. Pandemic, epidemic, avian flu, and other type of cross-border infectious diseases. So all 3 types, there is a very good data set that track a number of victims and affected people. So out of the global number of victims around the globe affected by a different type of disaster in the last 2 decades, every 5 victims around the globe, out of 5, 4 people are living in Asia. In other words, disaster victims are really concentrated in Asia. More than 80% of victims are in Asia. So this is one statistic I'd like to share with you to highlight how Asian Pacific region is really disproportionately affected by disasters. So here's a list of some high-profile disasters killing a lot of people. Indian Ocean tsunami, 2004 December, killed more than 200,000 people. Sichuan earthquake up 2008, mid-2008, killed almost 90,000 people. So, and also number of cyclones really affecting seriously many Pacific island economies and countries. So I think disaster is an issue, medium term, at least medium term, countries should tackle. So overall economic damage caused by disasters, we have a measure called the average annual losses. So this is average overall economic losses caused by different type of disasters. So this is the aggregate measure. So if we compute this economic losses ratio to the economic size, here asset over each country, then we reclassified our Asian Pacific sub-region. We can clearly say lower income countries in Pacific region, Asian Pacific region, and also Pacific sub-region in Asia, really disproportionately affected by disaster, encountering a big economic damage if we compare with the economic size and asset size and GDP size. So this is the really endorsing Pacific regions, sub-region disproportionately affected by disasters. And growth rate loss seems to be really issue. Using last 3 decades data, 3-4 decades data, covering more than 100 countries, almost 200 countries around the globe. And we explore how disaster affect the growth rate. Prominent disasters, top 25% severe disasters, really affect economic growth negatively. But here, Pacific regions are particularly negatively affected by high-profile disasters through losing economic development and economic growth. So also data shows direct losses, economic losses are really substantial, and also growth losses, medium-term and long-term growth losses are also substantial for, especially for Pacific region. So how then we need to tackle this medium-term, very serious issue, source of risk, especially for Pacific region. So here I postulated, we postulated conceptual framework. Disaster is caused by 3 elements, created by 3 elements. Number 1 is a hazard. For example, strength of wind speed. Okay. So this may be beyond the human control, although climate change, mitigation, long term, we believe we can control hazard. But in short term, hazards are beyond human control. Hazard is the number 1, big hazard. That is a source of a disaster. But at the same time, how people are exposed to strong wind, that's another element. If you are not living in an area with a high wind speed, that's okay. But if you are living in an area of high wind speed, that causes a disaster. So exposure is the second element. Third one is vulnerability or resilience. Even if high spin wind is blowing and you are living there, but if you are living in a well-structured home, you are okay. In other words, if you are living in a very simple home, your vulnerability is very, very high and leading to a big disaster. So disaster damage, human damage, and physical damage is really product of 3 elements: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability or resilience. And so this disaster caused by 3 elements turn into not only immediate human and physical and financial losses, but also long-term losses through losing jobs and losing income means. And more seriously, as highlighted in our report, this negative chain will persist over time or across space. So one family, one generation hit by big disaster, losing home, losing assets, losing jobs. Next generation's human capital investment undermined. So poverty trap triggered by disaster will persist across the generation. So that's the time domain spillover effect. Another one is Thai Ayutthaya area in Thailand, which has a very big cluster of a hard drive industry, global hard drive industry, hit by very serious floods, September, October 2011. And then hard drive producers are seriously affected. Immediately, global hard drive price hiked. Okay? So other producers in Asia and around the globe using hard drive negatively affected by this price hike of a hard drive. So that's a spillover effect across the space. So this is the conceptual framework, how disaster is created and how disaster impact spillover across time and across space. So issue is policy, including a government, each government as well as an international organization like ADB, how to tackle this issue and how to control this disaster nexus. One word, strengthening disaster resilience. That's a key policy challenge. There are three key elements of disaster resilience, strengthening disaster resilience. First one is mainstreaming, thinking of disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction is, there are basically two elements. Although this is formalized and adapted as the international global strategy of disaster at the Sendai Disaster Conference 2015, as a 2015 say the framework for disaster risk reduction. I think there are two elements, key elements of this first mainstreaming disaster risk reduction. First one is disaster investment. Disaster resilience related investment should be nicely well incorporated into medium-term and long-term development and investment plan. So, of course, the disaster risk reduction policy should be really strengthening short-term or medium-term resilience, but also that policy should facilitate medium-term and long-term economic growth and economic development. Okay? So achieving multiple dividends, not only controlling disaster risk, but also facilitating growth, multiple dividends or multiple purposes. That's a very important key point. And another one is shifting focus from after disaster response to more before disaster preparedness and prevention. So shifting investment more for preparation before disaster. It has been known it is more overall cost effective and more efficient and effective. One example, streamlining multiple dividend, cyclone shelter has been constructed in many Asian Pacific region as a very important infrastructure investment to building up a resilience against a cyclone. Okay. But cyclone, so construction of cyclone shelter, not to mention, definitely enhance a resilience against a cyclone. People can evacuate and people can stay safe in shelter. But this purpose should be widened to more medium-term and long-term development investment purpose. So cyclone shelter can be used as a classroom in non-disaster situation. Cyclone shelter can be utilized as a regular community meeting in normal times. So cyclone shelter not only building up resilience, but also facilitate human capital investment, also social capital investment that nurture medium-term, long-term growth. So this is a way, multiple dividends should be really nicely designed and implemented through disaster risk reduction policy, nicely incorporated into a medium-term and long-term investment. Second element out of three important elements of disaster risk, building up a strengthening resilience is using risk financing schemes and mechanisms. Big disaster, once in 100 years, kind of disaster, very infrequent, but causing lots of damage. That's often necessitates international support. So ADB has a contingent financing, for example, $6 million immediate support within 3 days or so. ADB disbursed to Tonga when Tonga was hit by Cyclone Gita last year. So these international supports are very necessary for big disasters. Okay. Smaller disasters and frequent disasters, government can manage reallocating budgets and also intertemporary smoothing resources. So risk retention can be possible in low-profile disaster and high frequency. But mid-range, moderately high damage and moderately high frequency, there is a huge room for market mechanism can tap, and the market mechanism can diversify away disaster risks and damages. Actually, one important figure I'd like to share with you is Asian Pacific region. Out of, this is data since the 1980s, so last 4 decades or so. Out of overall economic damage caused by all the different disasters, out of all the damage in last 4 decades, only 8% of economic losses are covered by insurance products. That means more than 90% of disaster damage, no market mechanism, no insurance mechanism really handle. So this highlights there is a huge room for insurance market to be properly developed and tap and diversify away disaster risks. In fact, we see lots of innovative insurance products popping up around the Asian Pacific region, especially South Asia. There are lots of number of very interesting, very new type of insurance, especially index insurance product, or index risk transfer products, rainfall and predetermined rainfall level threshold. If rainfall is falling below this predetermined rainfall, then automatic and quick insurance payout is made. So these are the one example, rainfall index insurance, or in other words, innovative micro insurance products. So we see a lot of new products popping up in this region. However, most of these innovative products are based on public subsidy, international organizations support, and also small scale. So I think scaling up and try to cover this more than 90% of an uncovered disaster damage, I think there's a huge room to nurture development of insurance products and insurance market. Finally, a third element of building up resilience is building back better. Building back better is a concept after hit by disaster. A reconstruction rehabilitation effort should aiming at better position than status quo before disaster. So not only building up more resilience against a disaster, but also, as I said, multiple dividends, multi-purpose, expanding opportunities, in addition to expanding safety and inclusiveness. These multiple purpose concept is building back better. Building back better is something government and other stakeholders act upon after disaster. But this framework should be carefully set before the disaster, and also mobility plan or resources should be carefully designed before the disaster. So this is something about action after the disaster, but again, beforehand preparedness and preparation. As a part of this shifting focus from after to before, BBB should be nicely set. And building back better, of course, speed is important, but we shouldn't sacrifice quality by aiming at speed. So not only speed, but safety, inclusiveness, taking care of especially vulnerable groups, as well as expanding a medium-term opportunity to materialize multiple dividends. So this is the very important concept, building back better. So these are the three elements how to building up resilience, strengthen resilience, so that our disproportionately affected, disaster-affected region can be more stronger to handle, and also continue medium-term and long-term robust growth rate. So with that, I'd like to stop my one-way speech here, and then I'd like to invite a lot of questions and comments and discussion. With that, I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's covered quite a bit of content in less than an hour. So we'll take some questions and answers now, and we have about 15 minutes for discussion. And you may want to introduce yourself if you prefer. Otherwise, you can just lift your hand up, and someone will come with a mic, and you can ask a question or make a comment, and then we'll ask a speaker to respond. Yeah, there's one here.
Thank you very much for giving the opportunity to ask a question. I'm Fazrul Rahman. I'm Director from Fiji Revenue Customs Service. It's a very good presentation, Professor. I think you have given very good insights in terms of what do we mean by resilience and how countries should be prepared for that. My question is basically building resilience in infrastructure in particular is largely contingent upon any government's public finance position. And given that we are in the wave of seeing mega cyclones, mega disasters and whatnot, what are the general policy recommendations like for countries in Asia Pacific to be prepared to be able to fund the challenges in building resilience? Thank you.
Thanks. I think you can respond to that while we wait for more questions.
Thank you very much. Actually, so infrastructure investment is really important for Pacific region, especially to continue development. 2 years ago, we made a special report, needs assessment of Asia and Pacific regions in infrastructure investment. So basically, using different sectors, transport, energy, ICT, water and sewage, past data matched with the growth performance, and also growth, medium-term growth forecast. We made a computation in order to continue growth rate, continued, and also poverty reduction trend maintained, as well as help achieve climate change, mitigation, adaptation in putting more clean energy, and also building up a resilience, especially in the transport sector. So we used actual data and made a computation. Pacific region is a region which needs the largest amount of infrastructure investment if we compare with the GDP. So roughly 9% of GDP should be annually devoted to infrastructure, different type of infrastructure, so that the growth, poverty reduction, and climate change, adaptation, mitigation can be achieved. But the 9% investment every year is a big challenge, and so your question is how to finance. First one is, of course, each government can engage some type of fiscal reform, tax reform, also carefully reorganizing expenditure so that public space, fiscal space can be expanded. And with that, public investment in infrastructure can be expanded. Also, some prudent borrowing government can engage. And a new type of financing, it may be difficult in many Pacific countries' context, but some type of financing mechanism such as so-called land value capture, constructing a road, but after national road or highway connected, adjacent areas, land price will go up. So government can capture this future land value increase and in turn temporarily reallocating that future benefit for investment today. So this is a scheme called the land value capture. Many Asian economies, countries utilize this land value capture mechanism to construct public transportation infrastructure. So I think, so overall government fiscal space can be expanded to make more investment in public investment in infrastructure. But again, according to our estimates, that space expansion is really limited to 20% or so, financing a gap of infrastructure investment. So latter 80% or 70% of investment should ultimately come to somehow from the private sector. Big sovereign fund, wealth fund, and pension fund assets are available in around the globe. Huge amount of assets under this zero interest rate or close to zero interest rate. So these funds are really eager to take higher return investment opportunities. On the other hand, Pacific region, Asia, growth rate is quite robust, and consolidated growth is 5-6%. So naturally, infrastructure investment can generate high returns. But the issue is high return, but at the same time high risk. So connecting big assets flowing into high return investment opportunity, issue is binding constraint is how to decrease perceived risk. Okay. So, or in other words, de-risking this Asian infrastructure investment. That's very necessary to tap private funding. So it's a big challenge, but at least partially can be handled. So ADB can provide credit enhancement and other type of guarantee so that investment infrastructure can be better for private investment, and also public-private partnership. ADB has been really facilitating. So I think international organization is one very important partner to help de-risking infrastructure investment so that broader investment base can flow into infrastructure investment. So this is this is a little bit lengthy response to your question.
Thanks, Prof. While we wait for more questions, one of the things you talked about was the disaster risk resilience framework, and you basically mentioned about the Sendai framework. Has there been any attempt by ADB to actually implement the framework in member states and identify the gaps that exist so that there's more resilience?
So actually, ADB adopted strategy 2030, so next 10-year strategy last year. And under this next 10-year strategy, we set 7 priority areas. Number 1 is poverty reduction, income inequality, reducing income inequality, including a broader creation of decent jobs. Number 2 is a gender focus. And then number 3 out of 7 priority areas is climate change related investment and also building up a resilience. So ADB is really mainstreamed. Next 10-year focus, one of the focus is disaster resilience. And already ADB helped member country to increase investment in disaster resilience. And also this next strategy 2030 really formalized more than 75% of ADB's supported investment should have focus on disaster up until year 2030. So actually, ADB is aligned with the 2015 Sendai framework. ADB really streamlined, mainstreamed disaster resilience investment. And currently, I have a figure. From 2010 to 2018, last 8 years or so, 240 new development projects incorporating measures to strengthening disaster resilience. And last few years, 5 years or so, 4 billion investment in climate change, broader climate change related investment, including disaster resilience. So I think ADB has been and will be really focusing on disaster resilience, aligned with global strategies such as Sendai framework.
Thanks. Any more questions from the floor? Humphrey is back.
Humphrey Chang is my name. I wear many hats, and because I wear many hats, I always describe myself as a private sector representative. First up, I would like to suggest to the professor that maybe he can take back home and have the name ADB changed to APDB. That means Asia Pacific Development Bank. Just one thought. The other one is, I'm a little bit concerned about the depression that is happening in developing Asia. In 2018, 5.9, in 2020, 5.6, and in China, the biggest, largest economy, from 6.6 in 2018 to 6.1 in 2020. Does that mean that there's going to be a depression around the world because of the GDP development, except for India? India is going up. Already the Reserve Bank of Fiji is saying that there's going to be no devaluation in Fiji. But someone like me is thinking that it may happen. But if it should happen, we're going to get from bad to worse. Because already our currency is very weak. We don't get sufficient fund for $1. Before we used to get at least 68 cents to a dollar, even $1 to a dollar. But now it's down to 46 cents to a dollar. Can you please explain a little bit about that? And the other one is that I like the issue that was published in the paper about private sector operation. It seems to me that somewhere along the line, the private sector will be gained by some direct contribution from ADB to the private sector and not through the government. Because a lot of time, when things go through the government, there's a lot of red tape. And private sector don't gain. But this article here is very interesting. And I think we should know a little bit more about that. Can you please explain? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First proposal, changing a name to APDB. I think that's a fascinating idea, and I think maybe it may take time, but I think ADB should seriously consider incorporating a Pacific explicitly in the name. And then growth rate, as I mentioned, overall growth rate is slowing down. around Pacific, Asian Pacific region. Main driver is the largest economy, China. That growth is slowing down. Behind this, again, I'm kind of recapping what I mentioned. This is really driven by a global business cycle. It's not really global economies turning into a recession, but there is always up and down of economy. And since 2017, it has been uplifting. And then this tilted downwards since the second half of last year. So this process affected slowing down, short-term or medium-term slowing down of Asian economy. That's the number one why we see slowing down. It's not necessarily caused by recession, but as a part of mainly electronic production cycle, there is a semiconductor production cycle that seems to generate the global business cycle. So that's the number one. Number two is, as I briefly touched upon in the context of Chinese economy, not only China, but also broadly speaking, Asian Pacific region, overall continuously getting richer and richer. Continuously getting richer and richer. In the process, you grew at a pace of 10%, 9%, 8%. That's amazing fast. That's possible at a very early stage of development. But once you became a medium income, middle income, and also your economy matured, it's by nature, it's not possible to continue 10% growth. So it's natural for any economy, as I briefly mentioned, once reached a certain point, growth rate continuously slowing down, mildly slowing down. So I think Asia, this is a really manifestation. Asian economic growth has been medium term, quite successful, and as a result, naturally, growth rate slowing down. And third part is Fiji's exchange rate. I think exchange rate should be, in general, should be determined by economic fundamentals. And Fiji's economy is rather robust because of the library service sector and tourism sector. There is some concern about liquidity, but liquidity of Fijian dollars, 300 million, is not really automatically leads to devaluation. I think the Fijian economy is very robust, as I again mentioned. Tourist sector has been continuously developing and now connected to major Pacific Rim countries. Investment in tourism sector is going forward. Concern for sustainability and sustainable tourism is well really incorporated in strategy of tourism strategy in Fiji. So I think all fundamentals looks quite good in Fiji. So I think reflecting this fundamental, I don't think Fiji Fiji is encountering a liquidity problem leading to devaluation. So I don't think there is a risk of devaluation right now.
Thanks, Awada. I like the way you responded to the first question, very diplomatic. I remember when Professor Joseph Stiglitz wanted to change the name of World Bank. Next day he was sacked and sent home. So a very diplomatic response there.
So that's this is purely from my personal viewpoint in the long term.
Now you're safe here. We'll take one more question. Right.
Got the phone. Got the mic.
Your 10's over. Sorry, you can ask during tea break. Sorry, we don't have. There are more people.
Sorry, I forgot to respond to your private sector question. So as I mentioned, Strategy 2030, next 10 years. ADB's core strategy, we set 7 priorities, gender, poverty reduction, resilience, urban development, rural development, regional cooperation integration, and also governance institution. So 7 priority we set. And when we operationalize these 7 priorities, shifting or putting more efforts to non-sovereign lending, private sector lending is one of the strategy of ADB. So I think next 10 years you will see more ADB support for library and potential growth of private sector. So I think that's a very important point, and ADB is fully aware, and ADB has this formal strategy to facilitate more private investment.
Thanks. We'll take 2 questions, one from there and one by Professor Nigel, and that'll be it for today. We'll have more time during the tea break, so you can get hold of Professor Sawada and ask him questions.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the very informative presentation. And my name is Melali Tapi. I come from Tuvalu, the smallest Pacific island nation. My question regarding your presentation is, it comes from the perspective of media. Because talking about building resilience, especially in regards to disasters, Tuvalu is very vulnerable to natural disasters. And it is vital, very important, that the role of the media is strengthened in terms of information sharing. Because at the end of the day, it is the people that will suffer from the consequences of natural disasters. Now, how can ADB, because also noting that media and broadcasting organizations in the Pacific are non-profit making organizations, how can ADB assist these media organizations in the Pacific, especially with radio and television broadcasting infrastructure, to be able to maintain and carry out their roles in information dissemination to the rural people? Because Tuvalu, there are people in the out islands. It is the media's role to get the information of the, say for example, tropical cyclone. We had the tropical cyclone Pam recently, and people were not really ready for that. And it is us, the media, that gets the information out to the people. How can ADB assist us in with our broadcasting and television infrastructure? You know, given the smallness of and the non-profit aspect of our media in the Pacific, especially in my country, Tuvalu. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll take one more from here. And Rashika, did you have your hand up? All right. I know I'll be in trouble if I don't allow. So we'll have from Rashika, Professor Nigel first, and then, all right, it's okay. Whichever makes it easier for you. And then one here. Otherwise, she'll send me several emails after this. So.
Thank you, Professor Sawada, for bringing this presentation to us. I'm just interested to know which other Pacific countries, apart from Tonga and Cook Islands, have access to ADB's disaster contingent financing. And also, I note from the report that I think Tonga's disbursement was made quite quickly after the recent cyclone. So I'd be interested to hear from you if there has been any more Pacific experience, any other Pacific countries that were able to access that facility recently. Thank you.
The last question from you.
Nigel Haley. This is a slightly different question, but it's about, you highlighted Fiji's dependence on tourism, 20% of GDP. Of course, that makes a real risk in the event of a cyclone. If a cyclone would hit, the west coast or along the Coral Coast, it would be quite devastating. Now, in New Zealand, where I'm from, we're very subject to earthquakes, particularly on the South Island. And we have the Earthquake Commission, which basically levies insurance premium against all homeowners and building operators, and then lays that off with Lloyd's of London. So when we had the earthquakes in 2011, it was fully insured. Do you see scope for a similar kind of cyclone insurance scheme of that nature operating here in Fiji?
Thank you very much for all the very important questions and comments. As to the first question about media, role of media is very important, or broadly speaking, early warning system is very important. I'm from Japan. You don't believe, but 1950s, Japan is one of the capital of global disasters. Lots of earthquakes and lots of tsunamis and typhoons also. You don't believe, but 1950s, whenever a big typhoon hit Japan, 5,000 people, 6,000 people just killed overnight. So that was a Japanese situation. But now I think that number of victims dramatically decline because of two things. One is a very reliable weather forecast and typhoon forecast system. So science is very important. Although earthquakes, still we don't have a reliable, prediction model. As long as frontier technology allow 1 minute ahead, you can predict earthquake in Japan right now, or I think 3 minutes before. But still, forecasting model for some type of disaster is really challenging. But for the typhoons, really a very good weather forecast system, satellite-based information, well connected together. Then, forecast of big thunderstorm or cyclone, that really convey information conveyed to the normal people, ordinary people. So this is an early warning system, dramatically science and also early warning system conveying information that really dramatically reduce the human calamities. So I think strengthening media is one big important part to convey information, reliable information, so that people's direct impact from disaster is really diversified away. ADB has been supporting a wide variety of different infrastructure, including ICT infrastructure. So I think there is a scope for strengthening media, and especially as a part of a disaster resilience program. Although how to design individual project and how to materialize this project, I think it depends on countries' context and countries' disaster resilience plan, etc., etc. But in general, I think there is a big scope, and also very important, strong media, strong information sharing early warning system on one hand. On the other hand, we need a very good science to predict, accurately predict big cyclone, big disaster. And then the last question about insurance scheme. I think, as I highlighted, out of three elements of disaster resilience, building up resilience, risk financing is really important, and also there is a huge scope for developing insurance market for disasters. In fact, learning from or partially big trend to make micro, as I briefly touch upon, micro insurance scheme, as well as a countrywide disaster risk pooling scheme. Caribbean countries started sovereign countrywide disaster pooling scheme called CRIF, Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. And then partially learning from that, Pacific Island country also started the PCRAFI, multi-country disaster pooling scheme. And I think having this scheme is doable and very important, and also because insurance, you need some framework beforehand, contingency framework beforehand, and if we can mobilize a private capital market, that can be really big, can make a big impact. So I think PCRAFI, and also they set up a company already. I think pushing this disaster pooling program is very important. But having said this, current scale of this disaster insurance pooling is still underdeveloped, and also there is a scope for further expanding and scaling up. Yeah, but I think this is doable, and also there are lots of challenges, technical challenges I can discuss, but constructing a reliable risk model so that the risk model can be used for very good, disaster insurance premium computation, etc., etc. So there are some technical issues, but I think there is a big scope for facilitating more, capital market and private market to diversify away particular disaster risks. Yeah.
Just a quick response to second question on ease of access to post-disaster finance.
Oh yeah, I think disaster contingent. I think I need to check which country has which amount of contingency financing. But broadly speaking, ADB is using this. In other words, this is so-called policy-based lending. It's not a project lending, but needs for the particular and also emergent needs of a country. ADB is, of course, we have a disaster contingency financing, but also even without that contingency financing, if big disaster hit particular country, we can use emergency support facility. So one example is when Rohingya refugees flowing into Bangladesh, we didn't have any contingency financing arrangement with the Bangladesh government in Bangladesh, but we mobilized resources to help emergency needs of the country. So I think in that sense, broadly speaking, all the Pacific Island countries are potentially eligible for contingency financing for any emergent needs to reconstruct or handle unexpected events.
Thanks. This brings us to almost the end of the program. I'll just ask Sotia Om, who's currently the acting director for Center for Economic Policy and Modeling here at USP, to just take a few minutes to thank our keynote speaker and probably provide a brief summary of the presentation as well as the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nilesh. Before I present a vote of thanks to Professor Savaram, may I summarize what the key message of today's public lecture. Through the presentation, we see the moderate prospect growth for the Asian economy, but nonetheless, the growth rate is pretty much higher than the global average. The fast-growing region in Asia is South Asia, and followed by the Pacific region. So there's a cautious, vigilant on what's happening to the global economy, especially trade tension between the U.S. and China, and should be watched closely because of the wide range implication and potential negative impact on this robust growth of the region. Professor also provides the good discussion on improving disaster resilience, talking about mainstreaming this disaster risk reduction into the long-term growth policy, and to promote risk finance to cope with these very unlarge, uninsured consequences of this disaster. And finally, he proposed the Build Back Better framework that have many mighty dimensions to cope with these challenges. And we have a very good interaction with the audience, talking about how to finance that, fiscal space, and some other important issues. So I think overall it's a very successful public lecture. And for that, we are very thankful for your time, Professor Savara, to come around and give a very good lecture. And for that, may we give a big hand of applause to our guest lecturer. Thank you. And we still have some time for interaction for the coffee break. So we have a refreshment. So please, you all invited to stay around and talk to our guest lecturer today. Thank you very much.
put edu. Yeah.